Picture this. A candle flickers in a silent palace chamber, its trembling light dancing over walls painted with gold and sorrow. Behind silk curtains, a young girl sits frozen, her eyes wide with fear as footsteps echo closer. She was once a daughter, perhaps a dreamer, now a concubine, a possession of an empire that devoured innocence. What price did she pay to serve the whims of kings throughout ancient history? Empires rose on the backs of conquest, and behind their glittering palaces, hidden from public eyes, lived women and girls trapped in gilded cages. These were the concubines, chosen, bought, or stolen to serve kings, emperors, and noblemen. They were symbols of power, luxury, and control. Yet beneath the jewels and silks, their lives were marked by fear, manipulation, and silence. From China's Forbidden City to the Ottoman harem, from the courts of Rome to the Mughal palaces of India, the fate of these young women followed a chilling pattern. Beauty turned into a weapon. Loyalty demanded but never returned. In this story, we'll uncover the dark history of girl concubines across ancient empires, the brutality they endured, the rivalries that turned deadly, and the forgotten cries that still echo through time. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, the ones that reveal what really happened behind palace walls, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps us bring more hidden stories from the past back to light. The air in the Mughal palace was always thick, not just with incense or perfume, but with whispers. Behind jeweled screens and latticed marble walls, an invisible world existed, one that pulsed with the heartbeat of hundreds of women, each living under the rule of one man, the emperor. To the outside world, the Mughal court was a paradise of silk, poetry, and power. But for the young girls who found themselves inside its harem, paradise was just another word for a gilded prison. Many of these girls were taken when they were barely old enough to understand the meaning of servitude. Some were captured from distant lands during campaigns, Persian villages, Rajput kingdoms, or the cold plains of Kabul. Others were gifts from noble families seeking favor. They arrived wrapped in fear and curiosity, unaware that their beauty had already become their curse. Imagine it, a caravan moving through the desert night, the rhythmic creak of wooden wheels, and inside a curtained palanquin, a frightened child staring at the stars, wondering if she would ever see her home again. That was how many concubines began their journey, as tokens of victory, not people of value. In the chronicles of the Mughal Empire, the emperor's glory is recorded in marble and ink, but their women's stories lie buried in silence. The harem was a world unto itself, vast and secretive, guarded by eunuchs who enforced the emperor's will. It was said that in the time of Akbar, over 5,000 women lived within those walls. Wives, attendants, musicians, slaves, and concubines, each ranked, classified, and watched. Life inside followed strict hierarchies. The chief consort sat like a queen at the center of a web, while the younger girls, newly brought in, lived on the edges, invisible and disposable. For every whispered song of affection that might escape those chambers, a dozen cries of jealousy and betrayal went unheard. The first night was always the most terrifying. The girl, dressed in silk, painted and perfumed, would be led through corridors glowing with lamps, her footsteps echoing against stone. The eunuchs spoke little. They were the gatekeepers, castrated as children so that no man but the emperor could touch the women of the harem. When the girl was brought before the ruler, she was expected to bow, not just in greeting, but in surrender. Some emperors were known for their gentleness, others for their cruelty. But in either case, the girl's body was not her own. She belonged to the empire now. In time, she might learn to smile, to dance, to please, For survival required more than beauty. It required cunning. Behind the shimmering veils, alliances were formed. Rivalries bloomed like poisoned roses. A favorite concubine could wield invisible power. A word whispered in the emperor's ear could determine the fate of generals, ministers, even kingdoms. Yet that same power was fragile. One misstep, one rumor, and she could vanish overnight, poisoned, exiled, or replaced. Imagine living in a world where love was a weapon and silence was the only armor. In those quiet courtyards under the moonlight, the girls learned to hide their hearts behind painted smiles. History remembers the emperors: Akbar the Great, Jahangir, the lover of Nur Jahan, Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal. But rarely do we hear of the nameless hundreds who shared their nights and bore their children, only to be forgotten. Some of these girls were barely 14. Their innocence became part of the empire's foundation, their tears unseen behind the splendor of festivals and feasts. Akbar, known for his wisdom, tried to regulate the harem's vast network, appointing female officials to maintain order and recording details of every resident. But even in his system, the women were treated like assets, their names, origins, and beauty catalogued as property. In some cases, if a concubine gave birth to a prince, her status could rise. For that reason, pregnancy became both a hope and a fear. A male child meant survival. A female child meant another prisoner born into the same cycle. Beneath the marble domes, the cries of childbirth echoed as much as the sounds of music and laughter. And when a girl died, from sickness, despair, or the slow poison of neglect, she was often buried without ceremony. No monument bore her name. Only the whisper of her presence lingered in the perfumed air. In this hidden world, faith was twisted into obedience. The women prayed, reciting verses to soothe their hearts, asking for deliverance, yet knowing freedom was only found in death. Eunuchs patrolled the halls to ensure no word escaped, no letter left the gates. The emperor's authority was absolute, but even emperors were prisoners of their desires. Jahangir, drunk on wine and obsession, was said to be both tender and terrifying. His passion for Nur Jahan became legend, but few know how many women were discarded for her rise. Some concubines attempted escape, though the punishment was death. Others disappeared quietly, their names struck from records as if they had never existed. It's said that at night the harem glowed softly under lanterns, a sight of divine beauty from afar. But inside, every shadow carried a story of sacrifice. Imagine walking those corridors, hearing soft footsteps, distant sobs, and laughter that didn't sound real. Every smile was rehearsed. Every friendship was dangerous. And beyond the walls, the empire celebrated its golden age, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, the suffering within. For the concubines, time moved differently. Days were filled with training, in music, poetry, etiquette, because every gesture could determine their fate. They were taught to sing praises of the emperor, to conceal emotion, to embody perfection. But beneath the discipline lay a quiet rebellion, a shared language of glances and unspoken grief. Some women found solace in each other's company, forming secret sisterhoods to survive. They exchanged stories of their past lives, a mother's lullaby, a lost friend, a home left behind. Yet even those bonds were fragile. Trust could mean death. A single accusation of betrayal could send one to the dungeon, where the scent of jasmine gave way to the stench of despair. Many legends speak of ghosts haunting the old palaces, voices of women calling softly through the halls. Perhaps they are the echoes of those who never had a chance to speak. The Mughal harem was not merely a place of pleasure. It was a microcosm of empire politics, a theater where beauty was currency and emotion was forbidden. Every concubine was part of a grand illusion, the emperor's paradise of perfection. But beneath the surface, the illusion cracked. The empire's grandeur rested upon the silent suffering of its women. They were mothers of princes, makers of art, keepers of secrets. Yet their names were erased by time, and when night fell over the palace, the wind carried their unheard prayers toward the stars. As the empire expanded and the Mughal dynasty grew in wealth and dominance, the harem became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, a place where intrigue and fear intertwined like the intricate patterns of Persian carpets beneath jeweled feet. The girl concubines, once children of conquered families or pawns of political alliances, found themselves part of a living machine built to serve the emperor's pleasure and prestige. The air was filled with scents of rose water and sandalwood, but beneath the fragrance lay the suffocating truth that freedom was forbidden, individuality erased. Within those walls, everything was measured. How one walked, how one spoke, even how one breathed in the emperor's presence. To displease was to disappear. To please was to become a tool. Imagine the silence of dawn inside the zanana, the harem's private quarters, where hundreds of women waited behind carved jalis, veils fluttering like trapped birds. Outside, the muezzin's call drifted over the palace, marking another day that would blend into the next. Inside, the concubines moved like shadows, each trying to preserve a fragment of herself before it was taken away. One story passed through the whispers of maids and eunuchs, the tale of Merunisa, a girl whose beauty was said to rival the glow of moonlight on marble. She entered the harem at 15, gifted by a nobleman seeking favor from the court of Emperor Akbar. Her name meant sun among women, yet her life was spent in darkness. She was taught to dance, to recite Persian poetry, to play the sitar, and to perfect every gesture until she became more performance than person. Her eyes learned to smile when her heart could not. When Akbar's son, Prince Salim, later known as Jahangir, first saw her, the moment sealed her fate. To the empire, it was a tale of love, the prince's fascination with a young beauty. But for Merunisa, it was the beginning of captivity under a new name, Nur Jahan, light of the world. Her rise from concubine to empress was a rare story of survival, but even her ascent came with a price. Her intelligence and ambition won Jahangir's heart, but also made her enemies within and beyond the harem. She navigated politics like a warrior, but the shadows of her past never left her. For every Nur Jahan who rose, there were hundreds of girls whose names were lost in the dark corridors, whose bodies were never buried with dignity. They were the forgotten daughters of the empire, sacrificed to maintain the illusion of royal perfection. In those same corridors, younger concubines were often drawn into rivalries that ended in blood. A single favor from the emperor could spark jealousy fierce enough to destroy lives. Poisoning became an art, delivered through a cup of spiced milk or a perfumed handkerchief. Eunuchs whispered rumors, senior wives plotted quietly, and the emperor, distracted by statecraft and indulgence, rarely noticed until another body was carried away in silence. Imagine the terror of living every day unsure if your food, your drink, or even your friend might betray you. Some concubines turned to faith for solace, carving tiny verses into hidden corners of the marble walls, prayers for mercy in a world that had none. And as the years passed, new generations of girls arrived to replace the fallen, repeating the same rituals of obedience and despair. By the time of Shah Jahan, the harem had become a city within a city, guarded by walls so high that not even rumor could escape. The emperor, famed for building the Taj Mahal in memory of his beloved Mumtaz Mahal, was also a ruler who inherited the same system of female servitude. Mumtaz herself had been chosen among many, rising not just for her beauty, but for her loyalty and mind. Yet even in that love story, celebrated as one of history's greatest romances, lies a darker truth, that she too lived within a structure that allowed no woman to truly choose her fate. The marble mausoleum that bears her name stands as both monument and metaphor. Eternal love built upon generations of unseen suffering. As the Mughal dynasty reached its zenith, luxury turned to decadence. Under emperors like Aurangzeb, the tone of the court changed. The lavish indulgence of his ancestors gave way to religious rigidity, yet the harem endured. It remained a hidden empire of women, ruled not by affection, but by control. Aurangzeb's austerity did not free them. Instead, it chained them tighter. The music was silenced, the festivals curtailed, but the fear remained. The concubines now lived under stricter surveillance, their movements restricted, their laughter forbidden. Many who had once found small joys in art and companionship now faced the dull ache of spiritual imprisonment. Some, driven by despair, sought ways to end their suffering. It was said that a few took their own lives, throwing themselves into palace wells or drinking poison smuggled in through sympathetic servants. Their deaths were never recorded. Official chronicles spoke only of divine order, not human pain. But beneath those records, the real story was written in silence. The Mughal Empire, for all its splendor, thrived on that silence, on the unacknowledged sacrifice of countless women who never saw the world beyond the harem's gates. And yet, even within this darkness, resilience took root. Some women turned to poetry, writing verses in secret, hiding scraps of paper beneath floor tiles. Others painted or embroidered symbols of hope into the fabrics they wore, small rebellions that only they could read. There were those who whispered lullabies to one another, sharing fragments of peace in a world of fear. They created a community of endurance, bound not by love of their captor, but by shared sorrow. One legend tells of a girl named Rahima, who taught others to read and write Persian when the guards were not watching. She was caught and punished. Her manuscripts burned before her eyes. Yet before her death, she told her students, "They can take our voices, but not the memory of our words." Perhaps that is why, centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered faint carvings on old Mughal walls, names, verses, please, they found not just graffiti, but testimony. Testimony that even in silence, the concubines had refused to vanish completely. The Mughal harem was an empire within an empire, ruled by invisible laws, haunted by invisible grief. Every emperor, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, claimed control over its women, yet none could erase their humanity. Their shadows lingered. Their stories seeped through the marble like ink through cloth. Imagine walking today through the ruins of Fatehpur Sikri or the silent chambers of Agra Fort, the air still carrying whispers of songs long forgotten. You might not hear them at first, but if you listen closely, beneath the hum of history, you can almost sense their presence. The soft weeping of those who once lived behind those walls, dreaming of the world they could never touch. By the time the Mughal Empire began to decline, its walls, once polished with grandeur, had started to absorb the weight of centuries of silence. The empire's splendor still dazzled outsiders, the poets, travelers, and merchants who described the Mughal palaces as jewels of the East. But behind those ornate doors, the harem remained what it had always been, a silent theater of suffering and submission. For the girl concubines, nothing had truly changed. The world beyond still saw them as symbols of luxury, while within the marble labyrinth, they lived and died without names. The decline of the dynasty did not free them, it only blurred their existence further. With each passing generation, their identities dissolved into myth, their stories reduced to rumors and footnotes. Imagine standing inside those empty chambers centuries later, where the light falls in thin golden bands through carved screens, illuminating dust instead of faces. You can almost feel their absence, not just as ghosts, but as reminders of how history chooses what to remember. and what to erase. The empire that had recorded every jewel, every conquest, every royal decree somehow found no ink for the tears of its women. As the power of the Mughals waned under foreign invasions and internal strife, the harem became a fragile relic, both feared and forgotten. When Nadir Shah's forces invaded Delhi in 1739, the looting spared no part of the royal world. Soldiers stormed the palaces, and the women who had been confined for years found themselves facing a new horror: the chaos of conquest. Some were captured again, enslaved anew under different masters. Others vanished entirely. There were tales of eunuchs dying defending the gates, of older concubines choosing death rather than dishonor. The echoes of those last screams were said to haunt the Red Fort long after the soldiers had gone. It was as though the empire's karma had come full circle, the conquerors becoming the conquered, the captors becoming captives. In the centuries that followed, under British rule, the remnants of the Mughal court turned into a shadow play of what it once was. The emperors were figureheads, their harems reduced, their power stripped. Yet, even in decay, the system of concubinage persisted quietly. A few concubines remained, serving the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who himself lived more as a poet than a ruler. For those final women of the Zenana, the story was no longer about power or glory, but survival. They watched the empire crumble from behind the same walls that had once held them prisoner. One might think that with the empire's fall came liberation, but history rarely grants such mercy. The concubines' lives ended not with revolution, but with obscurity. When the British documented the Mughal court, they described the harem as an oriental curiosity, a decadent relic of Eastern sensuality, never realizing they were gazing upon generations of human tragedy. The concubines became objects of fascination for Western writers, who turned their pain into exotic fantasy. Their suffering was romanticized, their reality rewritten. Imagine their anger if they could see it. Centuries of agony turned into decoration in someone else's story. They had lived as prisoners, and even in memory, they were denied truth. Yet in the poetry of Bahadur Shah Zafar, faint traces of their grief appeared. He wrote of walls that whisper of tears unseen, of silken shadows that hold forgotten prayers. Perhaps he heard them too, the invisible choir of women who had served, suffered, and vanished behind his dynasty's grandeur. In the crumbling aftermath of empire, some records survived, though fragmentary. British chroniclers, fascinated by the structure of the Mughal harem, described its size, its guards, its rituals, but never its souls. A few rare Indian historians, writing later, attempted to reconstruct the voices of those women through oral traditions. From these fragments, a few patterns emerged. Many of the girl concubines were between 12 and 16 when they entered the palace. Some were daughters of impoverished nobles, others captives from wars or gifts from allies. Their training was elaborate: music, etiquette, philosophy, yet their futures were already decided. A handful would rise as favored companions or even queens, while most would spend their lives behind screens, growing old in silence. Those who bore children might earn respect, but those who didn't faded away, their beauty forgotten like a wilted flower in an unused garden. Some were granted small estates upon retirement, but most were dismissed quietly, sent to distant corners of the empire to live out their days in anonymity. Imagine reaching 40 in that world, once the most desired, now invisible. The palace that had once consumed your youth no longer remembered your name. Even today, echoes of their existence remain scattered across India, in the ruins of Fatehpur Sikri, in the silent courtyards of Agra Fort, in the forgotten apartments of Delhi's Red Fort. Archaeologists find fragments: a comb, a mirror, a piece of embroidered silk. Each is a whisper of a life once vibrant, now reduced to artifact. Local legends persist, of a weeping woman seen at night near the harem quarters, or of faint singing heard in empty halls. Whether or not the stories are true, they serve as a kind of justice. They remind us that those who were silenced in life refuse to remain silent in memory. But perhaps the most haunting truth lies not in the ghost stories, but in the absence itself. That we still do not know their names. The Mughals left behind monuments of unmatched beauty. The Taj Mahal, Humayun's tomb, palaces of marble and gold. But they left no monuments for the women who lived and died unseen within them. Their legacy was consumed by architecture and erased by patriarchy. Imagine being one of those girls centuries ago, looking out through a lattice window as the empire stretched beyond the horizon, knowing you would never walk its lands freely. The sound of drums, of festivals, of victories, all belonged to a world you could not touch. You might have laughed once, danced once, dreamed once, but those dreams were traded for survival. Even now, historians debate the politics, the art, the expansion of the Mughals, but few pause to ask who paid the human price. The concubines were not just victims of an era. They were mirrors of its contradictions. Beauty and brutality, devotion and despair. Their silence shaped the empire's image as much as its emperors did. Without them, the grandeur might not have existed. And so, when we admire the marble of the Taj Mahal or the frescoes of the palaces, we are also looking at the reflections of their suffering, polished into perfection, hidden in plain sight. And yet, in the end, there is something quietly defiant about their story. For even in a system designed to erase them, they found ways to leave traces. In poems recited in secret, in lullabies passed from maid to maid, in whispered names carved into stone, they preserved fragments of truth. The empire may have silenced them, but time could not. Their shadows still breathe in the folds of history, reminding us that power built on pain never lasts. Empires rise and fall, but the voices of the forgotten always find a way to return. So the next time you see the grandeur of a Mughal palace glowing under the moonlight, remember, behind every shining wall was a story like theirs. A story of girls who were never meant to be remembered, yet whose suffering built the very legends we now revere. That is the true, dark history of the tragic fate of girl concubines in the Mughal Empire. A story not of queens, but of ghosts who never stopped whispering through time. The story of the Mughal concubines reminds us that history is often written by those who had the power to speak, and that the truest parts of the past are sometimes found in its silences. Behind every monument of love and empire stood women whose dreams were buried long before their bodies. Their stories may not be carved in marble or recorded in royal scrolls, but they live on in whispers, in the haunting emptiness of those ancient chambers. To remember them is not just to revisit the pain of the past, but to recognize how easily power can turn beauty into bondage. So, the next time you admire the magnificence of the Mughal legacy, pause and listen. Perhaps you'll hear their echoes, faint but unyielding. If you found this story moving, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and like the video. And tell us in the comments what kind of untold stories from history you'd like to explore next. Your support helps us give voice to those history tried to silence.